Come on, the Russian Federation has come so hard for the United States. At the UN Security Council, they made a very pleasant speech that got the whole world at shock. I want you to pay attention and listen to this because it's not getting easy at all. They reveal a lot of secrets which the world are yet to hear. I want you to pay attention.
Has our planet been so close to a global conflict as it is today? We have an unequivocal answer as to how we ended up at such a dangerous line. In an effort to maintain their own dominance in the world, the United States and its NATO and EU allies are increasingly drawn into a war with Russia in order to keep their anti-Russian project in Ukraine afloat. The root cause of the current crisis, of course, is not the U.S. effort to save the rapidly bankrupt and defeated Zelensky regime at all costs, and even more so, not in Russia's natural desire to eliminate security threats that arose after the unconstitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. The reasons lie much deeper, and we all understand this very well. The anniversary NATO summit held in the summer threw off the last masks from the collective West and clearly recorded the long-standing main task of the alliance to defeat Russia, a nuclear power, on the battlefield. And as we learned from the documents recently declassified by the U.S. State Department, the task of destroying Russia, excluding it from any security and cooperation schemes, was formulated in Washington immediately after the collapse of the USSR. Moreover, this task is acquiring a new meaning and a more specific dimension thanks to the efforts of the Russophobic young Europeans who have reached key posts in NATO and the European Union. Here, for example, is what Kaja Kallas recently agreed by EU leaders to replace Mr. Borrell from the beautiful garden says about Russia. There are many nations that are part of Russia. If there were more small states, then it wouldn't be so bad if the big power became much smaller. I wonder how Brussels sees the prospects for Russia's interaction with politicians with similar views. At the same time, the appetites of the North Atlantic Alliance, which completely crushed the EU and until the end of the Cold War positioned itself exclusively as a counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact, are not limited to Russia. Now, including at the aforementioned anniversary summit in Washington, the leaders of NATO countries have publicly declared their claims to a leading role not only in the Euro-Atlantic region, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. It is declared that the alliance is still guided by the task of protecting the territory of its members, but for this, they say, it is necessary to extend its dominance to the entire Eurasian continent and adjacent sea areas. This includes the creation of closed alliances of small geometry, such as AUKUS and various kinds of 3s and 4s. NATO's military infrastructure is rapidly moving into the Pacific region with the obvious goal of undermining the ASEAN-centric architecture, which for many decades has been built on the principles of equality, consideration of mutual interests, and consensus. To replace the inclusive mechanisms created around ASEAN, the United States and its allies are putting together closed confrontational structures subordinate to them. In order to contain Russia, China, and other countries whose independent policy is perceived as a challenge to its hegemony, the West itself has passed a verdict on the globalization system that has developed largely according to its own patterns. Illegitimate unilateral sanctions are the response to any manifestation of an independent political line. Washington has done everything to blow up, including literally, if we recall the terrorist attack on Nord Stream, the foundations of mutually beneficial energy cooperation between Russia and Germany and Europe as a whole. As a result, Europe is rapidly losing its independent weight and sliding into the role of an economic and political dwarf, dependent on any whim of the American suzerain. Dear colleagues, the mortal threat to all of humanity today comes from the fact that Western countries, led by the United States, which have been playing a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, have lost the understanding that a global conflict between key players with a very high degree of probability can lead to a global catastrophe. The Western elites, who still live in the Yalta-Potsdam system of international relations that emerged after World War II, have moved away from the principles of realpolitik based on national interests and indivisible security. It assumes that strengthening the security of one state should not undermine the security of another. The rejection of this understanding, manifested in particular in the unrestrained expansion of NATO, creates a real threat of sliding the situation into an uncontrolled escalation, which is well felt by our partners from the countries of the Global South. Through the efforts of Washington and its satellites, the system of global checks and balances, and fundamental arms control agreements has been almost completely destroyed. The United States is unfoundedly trying to blame Russia for this, but we have, as they say, all the moves are recorded. Against this background, there is a decline in professional diplomacy and a culture of dialogue, which has been completely replaced by threats and militaristic statements. We are witnessing this in its entirety in the megaphone diplomacy that dominates the Security Council and the UN as a whole. As a result, the channels of crisis communication have degraded to the point of complete loss. Accordingly, without such an insurance, which allowed humanity to survive the Cold War, the world was defenseless, and any provocation and rash step could lead to a global conflict. In the context of the proxy war between NATO and Russia in Ukraine, the danger of such a scenario increases many times over. I will not dwell today on our assessments of the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and the events that forced us to launch a special military operation in Ukraine in February 2022 in full compliance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We have talked about this many times, including at the UN in particular yesterday, and have repeatedly proposed realistic settlement formulas that would make it possible to stop hostilities. Whether to accept them or not is a matter for the Zelensky clique. At the same time, they already know in practice that each of our new peace proposals objectively turns out to be less profitable for Ukraine, given the dynamics on the battlefield and the rapid self-destruction of the Ukrainian state. Remember the Minsk agreements and the final document of Istanbul, which was torpedoed by London and Washington. Now in Kyiv, they are biting their elbows from missed opportunities, but the train, as they say, has already left. Today we heard from our Western colleagues the usual mantras calling on Russia to withdraw its troops in order to stop the war. In this regard, I would like to remind you that we sent troops in 2022 precisely to stop the bloody massacre that Kiev launched against its own citizens in the east and southeast, and which the West has been stubbornly trying to ignore since 2014. Therefore, Western recipes for resolving the conflict are not suitable. This was clearly demonstrated by the pseudo-peace conference in Bergenstock, which did not arouse enthusiasm among anyone except the Zelensky regime and its Western sponsors themselves. We understand more clearly the scheme proposed by the already mentioned Mr. Borrell. I know how to end the war in Ukraine. This can be done in a couple of weeks. Just stop the supply of weapons. But at the same time, the chief European diplomat himself stipulates that the West should not allow Russia's victory at any cost. The same postulate is spelled out in the documents of the NATO summit in Washington. Consequently, the Ukrainian crisis is only a particular element of the course towards confrontation, and confrontation that the West consciously and long before the events of 2022 chose in relation to Russia. And if we discuss something with Western colleagues, it is this, and not the issues of saving the skin of Zelensky and his entourage, to discuss how to get out of the spiral of escalation that threatens to destroy all life on our planet. And we, unlike Washington and its allies, were and remain ready for this conversation. Dear colleagues, I hope that everyone in this hall understands that this rapid degradation of the international situation must be stopped, at least for the sake of the future of future generations, who themselves cannot yet shout out to the politicians in Washington, Brussels, and London, who have gone too far in their geopolitical projects. It is difficult to do, but it is possible. For starters, as in the past, consensus is again needed on the basic parameters for peaceful coexistence. It should be based on the principle of non-interference in internal affairs and respect for the sovereign equality of states and their security interests. A new global security equation must be developed and guarantees that it will be respected. We are convinced that our world organization can also play a role in this equation because it is the UN Charter that is the cornerstone of the entire system of international law. In contrast to the so-called rules-based order, which is based solely on the interests and whims of Washington and its satellites. It is on the basis of compliance with the UN Charter that we can make the transition to genuine multilateralism as painlessly as possible, from which all states of the world, including the United States, will benefit. The sooner Washington understands this, the safer our planet will be. At the end of 2021, Russia proposed draft treaties on mutual security guarantees to the United States and NATO. They included the principles of the inadmissibility of nuclear war, non-damage to the security of the parties, non-deployment of MAUs, of military potentials in border areas where it could be perceived by the other side as a threat, and many other important elements. In fact, these are the confidence-building and transparency measures in the Euro-Atlantic region that were lost as a result of the destruction of the system of arms control treaties at the behest of the West. Unfortunately, the West then, at the end of 2021, arrogantly rejected a diplomatic way to resolve the accumulated contradictions, hoping to extend its hegemony by maintaining the status quo. This was his major geopolitical miscalculation. The development of events after 2021 confirmed this. In their original form, those safeguards initiatives are likely to be irrelevant, but the time has come to at least resume the thinking process about what the new security architecture in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasia could look like, and possibly even more broadly, taking into account the spread of the dangerous bloc logic to the Asia-Pacific region. This is especially important for the global South, which has been plagued by the ongoing geopolitical adventures of the United States and its allies, and is calling for resources to be directed not to militarization, but to development. Just think how much good for the world could be done if the hundreds of billions allocated by the West for the war in Ukraine were spent on development. In fact, even the UN today faces a liquidity crisis due to the actions of the United States, not to mention global humanitarian initiatives. Of course, such a conversation is possible on one condition: the West's rejection of its confrontational course towards Russia, and the illusion that it will be able to defeat us. Those who seek to demonize and threaten our country, contrary to truth and common sense, must realize that victory over a nuclear power, moreover, with such military and economic potential as Russia, is impossible in principle. I will say frankly, the West is now most afraid not that Russia will win, but that the truth will win with us. And this will lead to the fact that the countries of the world will stop being afraid of him. And this will undermine the hegemony of the United States and its satellites, without which they cannot imagine their existence, no matter what beautiful and cunning things Western politicians, including in this hall, say. And since the belief in justice and equality in the developing world is associated with Russia, we are not only not ashamed to enter this hall and this building as we, the head of the government of a country responsible for the most terrible crimes of colonialism and for most of the crises on the UN agenda tactlessly suggested today. We enter the UN proudly and with our heads held high. Madam President, in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the truth will definitely win. We will help her with this. The processes that have begun in the world are already irreversible. Therefore, we call on our Western colleagues not to try to contain them, but to integrate into them, thus opening a new chapter of equal international cooperation based on the principles outlined in our speech. There is simply no positive alternative to this scenario for all of us today. I would like to believe that Western states still have common sense and an instinct for self-preservation, which will help them realize this as soon as possible. Thank you for your attention. Response. Madam President, I apologize for my American colleague who tried to spoil your debate. Usually, we do not have an exchange of remarks in such a situation, but, of course, I cannot ignore his words. It is all the more surprising that these words were uttered by a representative of a state that is responsible for the overwhelming number of aggressions, crises, overthrows of democratic regimes, and human rights violations in the 20th and 21st centuries. You don't have to go far to do this. Even crises of the latter order are fully inspired, promoted and supported by the United States, including the crisis in Gaza, the worst crisis we have faced in recent memory, which has already resulted in the death of 42,000 people. If it were not for the five-fold use of the U.S. veto power and not playing along with its Israeli ally, people would have stopped dying in the Middle East long ago. This is what I suggest that our American colleague think about, and also take care of the fact that it is Western countries that have recently become more and more isolated in the UN and the Security Council. I suggest that we end our exchange of remarks here out of respect for our Slovenian colleagues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for watching to this point. Thank you so much for your support. I believe you have listened to the representative of Russian Federation. That was a brilliant speech. Everybody is talking about it. And I just believe that I can bring it here so that all of us can listen to it. You can as well leave a comment section of what you think about the video. Thank you so much. See you in the next video. Peace.